Right, this morning I'm going to talk about a study at the University of Cape Town with school management teams, principals in this case, on the Advanced Certificate in Education, Education Management and Leadership Development. And I don't want to confuse that with the other ACEs. This is specifically the one on leadership and development. It's not a subject ACE. Right. Now I'd like to just kick off by contextualizing it a little bit for you. On the assumption of the ACE, first of all, when it kicked in as a field study in 2007, if you just read that very briefly, in essence, what it's saying is that the department was tasking an individual to make a context better, which was quite an assumption at the time. And that was a field study that was done for 2 years, 2007 to 2009. And there were 3 studies conducted while that field study was in operation. And the 3 studies looked at, first of all, from an international perspective. There was one through Xenix Foundation and the department, and it looked at the qualification in operation over the 2 years, and we got an impact assessment on that at the end of last year. Secondly, the Department of Education did a quality assurance study. They also reviewed materials and changed materials while the program was in operation. And thirdly, they finished up looking at 16 schools. They looked at specific students that had been on the program while they were still on the program. So nothing was looked at after the program had finished, in other words, when they graduated. So this study that I've done has looked at the graduates of 2009 out in the field, and I went in at the end of last year. I'm still in the process of writing the thing up. Okay. Now, because it was looking at specifically what happened from 2009 to the end of 2012, because we put someone out there, we said they were going to do better. Did they do better? We declared them competent. And I'll come back to that issue about competency a bit later, because it's a major issue for us in what we as a higher level institution determine as competent in the field. So out in the field, we're talking to the context specifically, which in many cases is an extremely difficult context. We do not work in the main with functional schools. We're working mainly in township schools, and we've got to look at the culture in those schools and the competencies that are there. So we've changed quite a lot in our way of looking at this qualification. It's a project-based approach. There's no examinations, testing. We look at what's needed in the school. We look at how that's going to be addressed in the school, and we measure the individual and the stakeholders, and particularly the learners in the school. So first of all, we look at the person. And within the person, we're looking at the person personally and professionally. You know, what are their values? It links in with that growth plan that the department has. So they take a personal and professional growth plan, and we work on that quite stringently. And we've had to change. We've learned a lot ourselves in our approach to working with the students. Secondly, we're looking at the knowledge base. What theories are we putting in place? What are they learning? What are they doing with that content knowledge? And lastly, how are they applying that in the context? And at the end of the 2 years that they're with us, they get that qualification of applied competency. Now, there's a couple of issues around that qualification, okay? If a student is a borderline competent person, and they're qualified and they're out there, we're saying they're competent in actual fact. Question is, what would the department be doing once they're qualified? There has to be some other ongoing type of support for those particular students. Students that are declared not competent do not pass, but they remain as managers. They remain as principals. So we have issues around that. I go back every year, I tell them, to my knowledge, the department doesn't do anything about that. But what we're going to look at now is what does work. Right, now the research question then talks to work-based projects. As I mentioned, it's the context. They design what's required there. They only look at their own priorities. Their school is not the same as another school. Their challenge is against themselves in that context. So it's how do work-based projects initiated as part of a university-based academic program contribute to longer-term school improvement? And we're not thinking about school change, because change implies a replication, a change of something. You're putting something in place because you took something away. We're talking about improving what is there. So their research examined the sustainability of the 2009 graduates' work-based projects that emanated from course content in an academic program. And that was in order to understand if the learning translates to a practice that contributes to change and sustainable development in the school context. And I just want to say a little bit about the design. The sample I took was a study group. We have study groups running. I think I've got about 32 now. I have 250 students, by the way, on the program. Now, with the study groups, they were assigned mentors for 2 years, okay? So I looked at a particular study group. They were all school principals. They were all from the same area, even though the schools were different. They were all in primary schools. So I was trying to minimize the variables on it. And they all selected, they have 2 work-based projects over the 2 years, but one of their work-based projects was on discipline. Okay? So those things were all the same. What was interesting about this group actually is that they still worked together in 2013, and they went to a law conference last year. So there's got to be some research into the sustainability of those professional learning communities as well. All right, I looked at it from a realistic perspective. Now, if you're doing research, normally you would be looking at an intervention going in place in your group, and you'd be looking to see what happened at the end. You'd be looking at a control group against that didn't have the intervention. But in this case, it's a realistic perspective, and it looks at context. And what it says is that if X is the student, okay, I'm examining the mechanism of change. And the mechanism of change there is the work-based project, because that mechanism came in to the school, and then the outcomes, what emanated from that in that particular context. So I'm looking at what actually was happening. Right. Okay, I'm jumping on now and not going into anything else about my methodology, because I'm not going to waste time with that, and just tell you what do we actually find in those schools. We found that there was a tremendous amount of collective learning. They were effecting change. We found that there was shared decision making, and I'm only looking at things that worked. And what I did was I actually examined their reports at the end of 2009 on the work-based projects. I took at what they said had made a difference. I went back in end of 2012 to see if that had actually happened, and I looked at what had remained in place. What I also did was I did not interview people. I interviewed stakeholders, teachers, learners, parents, but I didn't tell them it was anything to do with the qualification. I only spoke to them about what they'd noticed had happened in their environment. Even though I wanted to link it back to the institution to show that we could have project-based learning in place that would make a change. Okay? The only person I could speak to about the qualification was the actual principal. And then I could take what the stakeholders were telling me and link it directly to what was put in place that wasn't there before. Okay, so what was coming out of all of that, the interviews, and there were observations there as well, and there were questionnaires, okay, was that there was a lot of collective learning that was taking place. Irrespective of the level, they were learning together. Learners were learning with teachers, were learning with the management. There was a lot of shared decision making in those schools. It was 6 schools, by the way. Distributed leadership was prevalent, and there was a distinct shift from just instructional leadership into distributed leadership through the program. There was communication with all the stakeholders, and that was constant. And there was reflection at all levels. And I think one of the most significant things for us was reflective practice. I struggled with it in the beginning with our students. The mentors struggled, and we have a team of 12 mentors. I have a team of mentors, assessors, lecturers, and facilitators. And we work according to the needs of our students. Reflection was difficult to get going, but once it was, we discovered that the principals would make sure that the SMT turned into reflective practitioners as well. And I was finding that the learners were becoming reflective practitioners as well. Professional learning communities. The two significant things actually from the research showed that it was the peer learning that was the most important, what they were learning from each other in the study groups. Also, one thing I've picked up demographically, the Western Cape is divided, and our students are divided into students in coloured, well, they would call them now Afrikaans and English-speaking schools, and they would call the black schools English medium, you know, English learning, language of learning and teaching schools. But what I was picking up was that if I left the students in an area, let's use, for example, Khayelitsha, and they were only mixing with other students from Khayelitsha, the learning was embedded. Because the culture of learning in those schools is embedded. Historically, we've got problems around that. And we're going to have to deal with that. If I had a homogenized group, I was finding that the learning was more active because they were contesting things, they were talking about things, and they were saying things like, I'm being humbled by what I'm learning. So we've had to shift now and sit with maps and try and get Mitchell's Plain to link with Khayelitsha, for example, so that we can get a lot more learning through exposure with people in our study groups. But the study groups, these professional learning communities, is extremely important. And the reflective practice, I think they were the two main things that came through. So what was it about the culture in these schools that made them conducive to improvement? Now, those particular schools had values in place. It was a big thing for me. I actually heard children for the first time in many, many years saying, we are happy here. I think in all my years of working around the country and being in predominantly township schools in all the years of my professional life, not many I've heard say they're happy. So what emanated from the program particularly that we could take back, I think for us it was certainly that things that we're doing correct, we need to do more of. But we can't ignore the context that we're in at all, and I think in the context we're in, we've got to address the fact that competency is an issue, which I mentioned already, and we've got to accept the fact that the combination of the socio-economic context and culture embedded in a school is underpinning everything. So I think we're going to have to be challenged and do a lot more in relation to the actual culture. I think we're doing a lot about context, but we're not doing enough about culture. And I think that, finally, just to wrap up, I think that that takes me right back to the fact that we've got to do a lot more work in our schools on restorative justice that we're picking up on that hasn't been done. And we have to do a lot more work in actually dealing with the embeddedness in the culture. And that might mean that we would have to work a lot closer with the unions into a shared vision of what we actually want going forward as an institution. So I've mentioned a few things from campus to context and in a broader frame because I'm running out of time, but I just have two last quotes that I've got for you that you can read quite quickly, that I think we're moving towards looking at, where Sudine is talking about an inside-out and an outside-in approach, which I think we'll have to move towards. And again, Jansen talking top-down, bottom-up. So I don't think we can just leave things and hope that we can change by training, by putting in resources, by assisting schools in many ways. I think we've got to actually go into the culture and the context. Thank you.